Welcome to another episode of the NT podcast. My name is Nemanja Jurišić, and today we have the honor of speaking with Professor Yoel Elitzur, one of Israel's foremost linguists and biblical scholars. Professor Elitzur, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming and for your time. Let me read for audience something about your background for those who don't know you. Professor Elitzur studied Hebrew language and Talmud at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he also earned his PhD. His career has combined academic teaching with extensive field research. He has worked with the Academy of the Hebrew Language, contributed to projects such as the Tanaitic Hebrew Dictionary and the Encyclopedia of Hebrew Language and Linguistics, and serves as a member of the Government Names Committee in the Israeli Prime Minister's office. So in this conversation, we'll explore one of the most fascinating and debated topics in the biblical studies, the composition of the Pentateuch and the linguistic development of the divine names in the Hebrew text. So I prepared 9 questions for Dr. Yoel, while he prepared a presentation as an answer on all those questions. So, Professor, I will share screen and your presentation. So tell us, what is your alternative theory of the composition of the Pentateuch in relation to the widely accepted documentary hypothesis? Also, can the usage of divine names such as Elohim and Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh be used as markers of sources within the Torah?
My starting point is the data, not the hypothesis. Just because a hypothesis is accepted by people today does not make it a better hypothesis than what was accepted by people in the past. Agendas and cultural conventions are constantly changing, not necessarily improving. For example, today it is accepted that marriage with your sister is a terrible thing, an abomination, while homosexuality is considered by most of the public opinion shapers a positive way of life. In the past, the pharaohs and following them, the Hellenistic kings of Egypt, married their sisters. In Aristeas' letter, Eleazar, the high priest of Jerusalem, heartily greets King Philadelphus and his sister wife. Are you or anybody sure that the perception of the present is more reasonable? As a researcher, I try to rely on evidence, and evidence alone. Anything that can be counted, tested, and compared to other information is my tool. Therefore, I see no need to deal with thesis, only with facts. It is the data that the supporters of the theory of the documents have collected that require consideration. The theories themselves, not. The first rule of all learning is to distinguish between data and interpretation. If one does not distinguish between the two, it is easy to get carried away into a system of circular arguments, a kind of perpetuum mobile. Source X is ancient or lay / priestly / Deuteronomistic because it contains the expression Y. Y is an early, late, priestly or Deuteronomistic qualifier because it is found in source X. Surprisingly enough, this simple and elementary view sometimes escapes the notice of great scholars. Here is an example. The term Edah, congregation, has been presented in the critical research literature as a typical example of what is called the priestly source, and has been seemingly explained as reflecting the religious community of the Jews who returned from the exile to Jerusalem and Judah in the early second temple period. The place and time that, according to the Graf Wellhausen school, is believed to have created the priestly code. At that time, they say, there was no monarchy in Israel, nor was there any independent political entity, This community was a religious community led by a high priest and other priests. The title Eda is very appropriate for this community. But what happened? Just as Galileo dared to throw two weights, one of 1 kilogram and one of 10 kilograms, from the top of the tower and show that both reach the ground together, contrary to Aristotle's rules that were copied from one author to another without checking, so it happened here too. Some scholars checked and found that the term Eda was completely absent from the books of Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, Ezra, and Nehemiah, the books of the Second Temple period. What about the classical scholars? How they didn't notice it? They were so convinced that the chapters of dealing with priests and sacrifices in Leviticus and Numbers were from the Second Temple period that it had, without them noticing, gone from hypothesis to fact. The truth is probably the opposite. The word was in use in ancient sources and belongs specifically to the early tribal society of Israel. See here in the bottom a typical expression of Cook, the commentary of Joshua. Nesiah Eda, the princess of the congregation, he says, the congregation is used regularly by P to describe Israel as a religious community, an unmistakable stamp of P. Now, a few words about the two divine names on which the doctrine of the documents was based. Anyone who reads the verses in the Hebrew original can immediately see that the so-called tetragrammaton, Yod Hei Vav Hei, and Elohim are actually two synonyms in all types of texts, in narrative text, in law, in poetry, in the story of the flood. In the story of the flood, for instance, the two names are mixed together. See this verse here, כאשר ציווה אותו אלוהים, ויסגור Hashem בעדו. And they came, male and female, of all flesh, came as God commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. Scholars with a surgeon's knife have managed to split the flood story into two stories, one of E and one of J, and to claim that the editor combined a word from one source and a half verse from the other. For it to work, they had to correct the word in a few verses. In this way, they have also tried to solve several real or imagined difficulties. Meanwhile, the Akkadian sources were discovered, and it turned out that the Babylonian flood narrative paralleled in many aspects the current biblical text rather than the reconstructions of the scholars. Many of the adherents of the documentary hypothesis today speak about JE source and not of two sources. However, all of this is actually not in my area of interest. As far as I am concerned, it belongs to the field of the study of the history of modern biblical scholarship more than to the study of the Hebrew Bible itself.
My next question, can the usage of the names of God provide intrinsic textual evidence of chronological development?
Look, I'm engaged in the study of Hebrew language and focus on the pure linguistic findings. I find 4 aspects related to the divine names in the Hebrew Bible that can provide diachronic historical information about the relative and in certain respects, even the absolute chronology of the composition of the books of the Bible. The first of the four, which is perhaps possible to argue about, is the effect that the Bible itself declares. God says to Moses, "And I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob in El Shaddai." Here you see the table of El Shaddai. Indeed, the combination El Shaddai is found, with one exception in Ezekiel, only in the book of Genesis, in live use, and only in spoken quotations, not in the words of the narrator. After Genesis and the above mentioned verse in Exodus, Shaddai without El is found a few times in Balaam visions, in the prophets, and in Psalms, to express power or to rhyme with the word shod, robbery. And also many times in the speeches or in the book of Job. What does it mean? You can see it in the table. What does it mean? It means that El Shaddai was a natural element in the ancient language and has ceased to be used, being adopted in an abbreviated form as a generally rare literary device from the treasury of the ancient language. Admittedly, it can be argued that this is an artificial creation by a later scribe, but three personal names in the Torah that contain the theophoric element Shaddai, namely, you see, it doesn't seem here, namely, Shedeur, Amishaddai, and Tzuri Shaddai, all of which are explicitly associated in the Torah with the generation before the Exodus, show the picture of the natural life of the name Shaddai. The second divine name is a very strong finding, the name Tsevaot. It appears 286 times in the Hebrew Bible, many psalms, and most prophets use it. And it is almost impossible to think of any religious statement without it. However, its first appearance is First Samuel chapter 1. 0 appearances before from Genesis to the end of Judges, and then suddenly it comes into so widespread use. Another interesting point, in the books of Samuel, it is used in the narrator's prose, and from there on, only in literary use by poets and prophets. The picture is, again, clear. It was created with the books of Samuel, initially used in living speech, also in prose, and in a second stage, it became a literary expression. Professor Alexander Ophé of Israel dealt with the subject. However, he didn't let the facts confuse him, and he wrote, as you see, the conservative explanation that the name Tsevaot came into use at the end of the period of the Judges can be rejected out of hand. The written documents about the beginning of Israel are far from being contemporary with the events, and most of them were composed between the 10th and 4th centuries BCE. What then is the solution? In his opinion, purist editors removed Tsevaot from the 7 books before Samuel. Okay. Another author, named Aviyah HaKohen, suggested the opposite. Later editors added Tsevaot to the books from Samuel onwards. In my opinion, the facts are stronger than the excuses. By the way, I have to note that both of them didn't notice the distinction between the living use of Tsevaot in Samuel as opposed to its later transformation into a literary name. The third finding is the increase of the Yahoo component in personal names. In the Pentateuch, there are perhaps two such names, Yocheved and Joshua. But Joshua is, according to the scripture, a new name that Moses gave to his faithful servant. And even for Yocheved, some claim that the name is to be interpreted according to Egyptian or in comparison to West Semitic names, not as a Hebrew theophoric name. Okay. In the books of Judges and Samuel, the percentage of names of this time is 12%. In the days of Solomon, it rises to 17%. From here until the days of Ahab, there are 28% of the names of this time. From the days of Ahab onwards until the destruction of the first temple, it reaches 50% or more of all the names in the Bible and in epigraphy. This is a gradual, natural development that cannot be attributed to later editing. I conclude this review with my own discovery. The name Adonai appears about 440 times in the Bible. Of course, this does not include the Tetragrammaton, Yodei Vav Hei, which according to the practice of reading the Bible in Israel since the middle of the Second Temple period, is pronounced Adonai because of its holiness. I am referring here only to places where we find the name Adonai in the written text. One day, I noticed that Adonai actually begins to exist as a divine name only starting with Isaiah, Amos, and Kings. In all the books from Genesis to Samuel, it appears, but only within a quote of an appeal of submission to God, in exactly the same situation in which the appeal Adoni, my Lord, appears to a person. Both forms, Adoni and Adonai, are equivalent ways to express my Lord. Why? The former is derived from Adon, a singular form, and the latter from Adonim, plural form of honor, like Elohim. This derivation is found in other forms as well, such as Adonaihem, their Lord, and not Adonam, their master or Lord. You see in the table that 0 objective divine names from Genesis to Samuel, but from Kings, Amos, and Micah a little, and especially Isaiah, it becomes very common. So here we can look at the development also in absolute dating. We'll talk about it in the continuation. Yes.
Yes. Okay. So thank you, Professor Elitzur. So there are old words that are and titles and names that are found in Torah and not later. And reverse, there are some things that are not found in Torah and found later. So that's really amazing. So thank you. My next question is, do the usages of God's name, Shaddai, Tzavat, the component Yahu in personal names, and Adonai point to the antiquity of the material and written or oral traditions used by the authors of the Torah? Or do they rather indicate the dating of the books themselves in their final form?
In my opinion, it is clear that they teach about the written books themselves and not about mere oral tradition or fragment of written texts that were collected or compiled during later periods. The totality of the findings demonstrates it. Thus, the complete absence of Tzebaot until Samuel, compared to 286 from Samuel onwards, The creation of the name Adonai provides an accurate date, since the period of Isaiah and Amos is known without doubt. Both prophets lived and acted in the 8th century BCE. It is clear and agreed that the book of Amos and the first half of the book of Isaiah were written in their time or very close to their time. If the book from Genesis to Samuel were compiled or edited in their period or after their time, we should have found the name Adonai in these books.
All right, really good answer. Next question. What other linguistic arguments would you put forward in support of the claim that the Torah is older than the other books of the Hebrew Bible?
My point of departure is that every language changes all the time, sometimes in connection with changes in reality and lifestyles, and sometimes for no reason. Slang changes quickly, and the standard language a little more slowly. My mother tongue is modern Hebrew, but the language I myself spoke in my youth is somewhat different from the language I speak today. I am sure that you can also provide examples for emergence and disappearance of words and or linguistic characteristics from the language spoken in your country. There is no logical reason to think that this did not happen during the biblical period. Most researchers have already been convinced by the studies of my teacher, Avi, you see his picture here, who passed away not long ago, and his colleagues and students, that there is a considerable difference between the biblical Hebrew of the period before the Babylonian exile and that after it. Next slide. In the studies I have published, give it out of that. In the studies I have published, I have shown that to the same extent and even more, there were developments and changes in previous periods as well. Some of the findings that I presented in my articles I took from studies by others who didn't manage to enter the mainstream of research. I am also in correspondence with people who have added new data to me. I recently submitted 2 joint articles for publication together with 2 of them. I have about 90 words, roots, expressions, and linguistic phenomena that had confined time of life within the classical biblical Hebrew. And I am currently preparing a book that will compile the material I have published in my articles along with additional findings. My articles have been published in recognized scientific forums, and I hope and pray that scholars of the Bible and the Hebrew language will be free from fear of innovations and will seriously consider the evidence I present. You ask about difference between the language of the Torah and the language of the rest of the Hebrew Bible. In one of my articles, I collected examples of such differences. Then I became aware of several other studies by others, in particular, a new book by Aaron Horenkol, a student and partner of Avi Horvitz, that dealt with this topic. From all you see here his book. From all of them, I now have 17 linguistic features that are found only in the Torah or almost only in the Torah and not in the prophets and writings. The most famous of these are the spelling Hu, Hey, Vav, Aleph for both he and she, and Na'ar without the final Hey for both boy and girl. In the rest of the Hebrew Bible, and in later Hebrew, there is a clear distinction between the masculine and the feminine. Hu and Na'ar for the masculine, and he and the Na'ara for the feminine. I have an idea how to explain these 2 peculiarities, but this is not important for our conversation. The main argument here is that the fact facts than the fact itself, and the fact speaks for themselves. Only or almost only in the Torah we encounter the personal pronoun ha'el, these, alongside the standard ha'ele. We encounter nahnu, we, alongside the standard form anachnu. Nahnu is known in Arabic and ninu in Akkadian. In the primitive senses of family, clan, the ancestors of the family, alongside the standard sense of as nation. 14 occurrences of Kesev, young ram, metathesis of the regular keves, known only in the Pentateuch. In the Pentateuch, contrast to the prophets writing in late Hebrew, most complex numbers are expressed in ascending order, such as 1356. Now, of particular importance are the cases where I find an affinity with history and archaeology. In such cases, I can speak not only of relative diachrony, history of text, but also of absolute history. In the Torah, I have two such findings. One is the term be'er, well of water. The word is found in the Torah 27 times and describes a common reality of life, a well that is dug into the groundwater and the water is drawn from it. It is usually a public entity of an entire settlement or an entire tribe or clan. In three contexts, the Torah mentions the term bor, which is a cistern located in the yard of a private person and into which rainwater is collected during the winter. In the prophets and writings, the word be'er is used once instead of bor in the role of cistern, and several more times as a literary concept. As a concept, well, not even once. From the archaeological findings, we know that the Canaanite settlement of the Middle and Late Bronze Age was mostly located in low-lying areas and was usually supplied by wells. In the Iron Age, on the other hand, most of the settlement was in the mountains and semi-desert areas, and people received their water from cisterns. This means that the Torah corresponds to the second millennium BCE, while the prophets and writings belong to the first millennium BCE. Another indicator of early date is the expression Arami Oved Avi. My ancestor was a fugitive Aramean. The Torah in chapter 26 talks about bringing the first fruits to the place that the Lord will choose. The man who brings the first fruits is commanded to tell briefly the historical story of the people of Israel, who started from scratch, went through slavery in Egypt, and at last arrived in a land flowing with milk and honey. This historical overview is opened by the words Arami Oved Avi, meaning my ancestor was a fugitive Aramean. The title Aramean as a symbol of a destitute nomad is not at all appropriate for the first millennium BCE, when the Arameans were a very strong military force, and for about 200 years, the most powerful force in the Levant, leaving behind a number of royal inscriptions many times greater than all the peoples of the region. During the second half of the 8th century BCE, they were defeated and exiled by the Assyrians and practically ceased to exist. So They were not nomads and not fugitive people. In contrast, in the period before 1100 BCE, they were indeed a people of shepherds wandering in the Syrian desert and around the settled peoples. So it belongs to the second millennium BCE. Several far-fetched explanations and textual corrections have been proposed for this text to fit the conventions that date the writing of the Deuteronomy and even the beginning of its creation to the period of the end of the First Temple period. But the verse as it stands again fits the second millennium BCE.
Dr. Elitzur, thank you so much. Now, a question: does the use of the expression nasahet, to bear sin, in the sense of responsibility for punishment in Leviticus 19, 20, 22, 24, Numbers 9, 18, etc., demonstrate that the holiness code stems from the exilic period? Outside of age or holiness code, the expression nasahet occurs only twice in the Hebrew Bible: Ezekiel 23:49 and Isaiah 53:12. The distribution of the expression is striking in light of its similarity to the Neo-Babylonian legal idiom hitu, shari, shadadu, or zabalu. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce those words. So that means to bear responsibility for the king's punishment. This expression was a technical term for conditional legal liability for guilt and appears exclusively in late Babylonian documents. Two examples of this hitu expression are found in a collection of about 200 cuneiform texts recording Judean presence and activity in Mesopotamia in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. One example comes from Al-Yahudu, Judah town, apparently a special Judean settlement in Babylonia. In the 10th year of Darius, circa 513 BC. The other from Babylon in the 3rd year of Xerxes' reign, circa 484 BCE. How do you respond to this argument?
Okay. The notion that sin is a kind of heavy burden and that forgiveness is carrying of it is a simple human thought that cannot exist in several languages and in several periods. The phrase nose avon vafesha v'chata'a, literally bearing or carrying iniquity and transgression and sin, is also found in Exodus 34. Similar expression v'lo yis'u avon, King James, that they bear not iniquity, exists in the description of the priestly garments in chapter 28. Isaiah 33 reads, Ha'am hayoshev ba nesu avon, the people that dwell therein shall be forgiven their iniquity. So we see that to carry avon is exactly like to carry chet. So it is not something that was created in the New Babylonian period.
Thank you again, Professor Yoel. Now, Baruch A. Levin has drawn attention to Persian loan words in the Holiness Code, that is Leviticus, Book of Leviticus, such a part of that book. So, such as the term Mikhasaim. Yeah, thank you. Mishkan and the name Parnak. Does the presence of these words indicate that the Holiness Code was composed during the Persian period?
It seems to me that you are not presenting Levin's words accurately. I do not see any influence of the Persian language in the two words Michnasayim and Mishkan. Both words are derived from Hebrew roots in a standard derivation. I can't see what is the problem of Levin that Levin has with Mishkan. Regarding Michnasayim, he's probably relying on the fact that the root kaf, nun, samech, kanas, in the sense of to introduce or to come in, generally belongs to later layers of Hebrew. Okay, about Parnach we will talk in a moment. First, I will address this issue at the fundamental level. In the book of Genesis, there are two words that were undoubtedly borrowed from Greek or a language or dialect close to it. The two are Pilegesh, concubine, and Mecheroteihem, their weapons. Do we learn from this that Genesis was created after Alexander the Great? Another example, in the book of Exodus, chapter 12, it is said about the Passover sacrifice, Al tochlu mimenu na. King James translates, eat not eat raw. And similarly other translations. If you want to be precise, the meaning of na is half roasted. This word is no longer known in the entire Bible. And in post-biblical literature, it is mentioned only in connection with this verse in Exodus. It is also unknown in the Semitic languages that were spoken around the land of Israel in ancient times. But it is well known in Arabic in the form ni'i. The Arabs who were nomads and whose diet consisted mostly of meat roasted on fire needed this word more than other peoples. Okay, can we conclude from this comparison that chapter 12 of the book of Exodus was written after the Arab conquest in the year 740 CE? Now, let's talk about Parnach. Parnach. From its form, it's clear that it is not of Semitic origin. And it is true that such a name was found in Persian sources and in Aramaic seals from Achaemenid Persia. But in my opinion, it could also be an Egyptian name. Per is a very common word in Egyptian and means house. En means off. And ka is an equally common word that means generally thought and soul and work, and for some reason also bull. A parallel combination is a hutka, literally house of soul, used for a tomb or chapel. So Parnak might well be an Egyptian name, in my opinion.
Right, we have a city, I think, Per Ramses. So Per means house. So yeah, house of the Ramses. So yeah.
Yes, in the word Paro, also Per is house. Paro, Per'a, it means the big house. Okay.
Yes, thank you. Okay, next question. This is a comment from Joel Baden. He wrote this in email to me. He said, I don't see any evidence of a likelihood for D, he means the source, existing in any form before the 7th century. So how would you comment on this statement?
It was written not in a book or article, but in a correspondence with you, yes?
Yes, this is from email, yeah, correspondence.
Okay. I apologize for not being familiar with Baden research, and perhaps I'm afraid that he has not read mine either. The fact that the only language I speak fluently is Hebrew, and that I was raised from childhood to read several chapters of the Torah in the Hebrew original every Shabbat, that I understand the Hebrew original of the Torah much better than its translation into any language. I think it gives me an advantage over any scholar born and raised in a different environment. When it comes to sensing the character of language, actually, I have already answered your question. If the Book of Deuteronomy was of the 7th century or later, one would expect to sometimes mention the divine names Tzebaot, to divide the name of Adonai, not use Hu, He, Vav, Aleph for she instead of He, Yud, Aleph, not to omit the Hey of Na'ara. We have also mentioned Arami Oved Avi. My father was a lost Aramean or Aramean nomad. That corresponds with the 2nd millennium BCE. In Isaiah 13:20, we read, Lo Yahel Sham Aravi. Lo Yahel Sham Aravi, neither shall an Arabian pitch tent there. If the book of Deuteronomy was written after the days of Isaiah, it should read, Aravi Oved Avi. My father was a lost Arabian, not an Aramean. Let's continue.
Very good argument. Thank you.
Let's continue to another slide. Another important finding, I learned it from Aaron Cole's book, is the verb yasaf, yud samech pei, to add. In the Torah, it is almost always appears in the kal stem, while in the rest of the Bible, it is hosif, in the hif'il stem. The Rabbinic tradition pronounces the word with the hif'il where the spelling allows it. But when the spelling doesn't allow it, it remains in the Torah in kal. I will not dwell now on the reason for this transition, which requires a somewhat complex linguistic explanation. What matters is the evidence itself. In this regard, too, Deuteronomy behaves like the other books of the Pentateuch, and it has Yasaf and Yosfim in the kal stem.
What do you think of the theory that the Torah is a product of the United Monarchy? That is, that the Torah was largely composed during the time of David and Solomon in the 10th century BC. That's proposed by Gary Ransburg, Daniel Block, and others. So, what do you think?
I'm a friend of those two scholars. But some of the findings we discussed today, such as Be'er and Arami Oved Avi, point to even earlier date. In terms of content, as the Torah presents itself, it addresses a people living in tribal life, which has not yet entered the promised land. Jerusalem is not yet on its horizon, and instead, the Torah speaks only of the place that God will choose. The critical approach sees all of this as a type of sophisticated forgery. In 10th century dating, the 10th century dating that is accepted today by conservative scholars like those who you mentioned, is a kind of compromise between what the Torah says about itself and the critical views. As for me, it is not clear to me what the need is and what the logic is in such a compromise.
Right. Would you at least say that you respect that option, but you don't endorse it? You disagree?
I don't know what reason could be to accept this dating.
Yes. Okay.
When biblical criticism began its journey, European culture knew a world in which classical Greece was the most ancient entity on the known horizon, and in its subconscious, it found it difficult to accept the existence of an alien culture. Meanwhile, we have been exposed to much richer and more ancient cultures throughout the ancient Near East, and for some reason, only the Hebrew Bible remains as something whose antiquity cannot be accepted. This is reminiscent of the parable of the horses that ran away, but the cart continues to roll down the slope.
Yes, my last question is after discussing all these questions about the composition of and historical context of the Torah and the Holiness Code, what would you say is the main takeaway? And what message would you give to viewers who are interested in these topics and want to learn more?
My recommendation, try to research everything yourself as much as possible. Don't repeat conventions just because they are accepted. Focus on the facts and be careful not to turn hypotheses into facts. I myself live in a Jewish religious setting that asks me to make statements of one kind. On the other hand, I live in an academic setting that expects me to make statements of another kind. What do? I don't make statements or repeat hypotheses. I point to facts and evidence, and I try to draw reasonable conclusions carefully. Thank you.
Beautiful conclusion. Thank you, Professor Elitzur, for sharing your insights with us today. Dear audience, thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow NT Podcast and share it with others. And stay tuned as we continue to explore the rich intersection of language, theology, and history. Until next time, see you.
God bless you.